Hello everybody and welcome back to another math video. Today we are going to be learning how to solve percent problems by using proportions. And if you haven't seen them before, proportions are one of the most important middle school standards. It's something that your brain does each and every day. Frequently though, when you think about a proportion, you're not going to write it down. And we're going to talk a little bit more about proportions in slide 2. However, by the end of the video, I'm hoping that you are able to solve these types of percent problems using proportions. And because I can't resist, I made sure to include a little bit of a pun here. And I want you to know that my wife thought this one was slightly funny, which I will always take. Let's get started. Whoops, there we go. Alrighty, so first question is, what is a proportion? And I define a proportion as a type of equation, which is something we've worked with a lot recently, where two ratios or fractions are set equal to each other. And this is the part that's really important, that it must be fractions that are set equal to each other. And this is why you're doing a proportion constantly every day, because we always think about something like what's equal to a half or what's equal to 2/3. We just frequently don't write it out. This thing right here is what makes a proportion an equation, is you need that equal sign. So it's very important as we work through these examples to remember, in order for it to be a proportion, you need an equal sign. Very, very important. Now, a couple examples of non-proportions would anytime you have two fractions set equal to each other that are not equal. 5/6 and 4/5 are not equal, so they are not a proportion. Same thing with 41/57 and 1/2, not a proportion. Now that brings us to, how do we solve proportions? Well, first of all, I like the idea here when I'm given fractions. One of the ways that I can figure out how to tell if the fractions are equal is something called cross multiplying. Okay? This is a skill that you are going to do a lot in middle school math and a lot in high school math. It's a very important mathematical skill. And the idea is you multiply the top left number times the bottom right number, and the bottom left number and the top right one. And this only works with proportions, two fractions that are set equal to each other. Well, 1 times 8 is 8, and 2 times 4 is 8, which this is a true statement, which means these fractions are equal to each other. So one of the ways that we can solve a proportion is by making sure the fractions are equivalent. It's kind of like checking to make sure it is a proportion. However, most of the time, you're going to be given a variable on one part of your equation. In this case, in the top right, we have an x. And we need to ask ourselves, how do we know what the x is equal to? Using a little bit of critical thinking might be able to get you this answer, but you can also do cross multiplying. Once again, we take this number times the bottom right and the bottom left times the top right. And you can do them in either order. For example, this time I'm going to do 6 times x. We don't know what x is, so we just write 6x. And we do 3 times 14, which is 42. And we now have a linear equation. And we've worked with linear equations before. Just like we've always done, we need to divide both sides by 6 because we want that x to be 1x or alone. So we have 1x is equal to 7, or we have x is equal to 7. Either one of these are correct, which means our proportion is 3/6 is equal to 7/14, which makes sense because this is a half and this is a half as well. Now I want you to try this one on your own. I'm going to pause the video and put a question in and see how we did. To save us a little bit of time, I wrote our answer down here already on the side. I did 8 times 18 and got 144. I did y times 2 and got 2y. I solved my equation and I eventually got an answer of 72. Now, proportions can also be used to solve percent problems, which is really the major goal of this video. And before this point, you've probably seen something like either one of these. The idea that percent means per century or per hundred. So one side of our percentage is something out of 100. Okay, that's what a percent means. But a percent also means a part of something out of the whole value. So if I'm shooting 12 baskets, and because it's me, I make all 12 baskets, because of course I do, that would be a percent of 100, 12 out of 12. Okay, now if you're one of my students, I'm going to just make up a name, but let's go Landon, just off the top of my head. Landon shoots 12 baskets. Maybe he only makes 4, but 4 out of 12 would be 33%. Now we can use that information to help us solve some percent problems. If I have 15% of 84, in order to set up this percent, I need to remember that I'm making a proportion. So I set that up right away. Now, if I look out of here, I know part out of whole. Well, 15% of something, well, 84 would be the whole value here. And we're looking for the part, and that would make this x. Now, on the right side, the value of 100 always goes down in the denominator because percent is always per 100. Then the 15% needs to go on the top. And this is what's important here. Don't put the percent sign because 15 out of 100 is 15%. And from here, I now have a regular proportion that I can solve just like I've been solving the others that I've worked with so far. So I'm going to cross multiply again. X times 100 is 100x, or 100 times x. 84 times 15 is 1,260. Now I'm going to pretend I did that in my head, but in reality I have a calculator sitting next to me. But we can pretend. Now I have an equation. I'm going to solve this equation just like I've done for the last few problems. I'm going to divide both sides by the coefficient of x, which is 100. And I get x is equal to 12 6/10, or 12.6. And decimals are just fine when we're working with percent problems, and they're just fine when we're working with proportion problems. So our answer here is 12 6/10. Let's try another together and see how we do. Once again, I need to set up a proportion. And I know that it's always percent out of 100. In this case, it'd be 80 out of 100. And now here's the big question. Is that 48, is that the part or the whole? Because if it is the total or the whole, it should be in the denominator. If it's the part, it should be in the numerator. But 80% of something will make it smaller. So I know that 48 has to be the part. And then the whole would be x here. And once we have the proportions set up, we can cross multiply again. Do it over here on the right. 80 times x is equal to 4,800. I am going to try to draw a straight line on my tablet. That wasn't too bad. And I divide both sides by 80, which gives me 1x is equal to 60, which means that 48 is 80% of 60, which makes sense because 80% should make something slightly smaller, but not quite cut it in half. And 48 is smaller than 60, but definitely more than half. So let's do a last example here, and I want you to try this one on your own again. 35 is what percent of 700? Be careful. What percent means that should be the top right of our proportion. So this problem, what I did is I did 35 out of 700 because 700 is our total, 35 is our part. 100 has to be in the bottom right because it is the percent per 100, and X went up here in the top right. I solved my proportion and I got 5, which means that 35 is 5% of 700. Now, we're not expecting you to have this skill completely mastered, but we're hoping that this gives us a little bit of a starting point when we're working with both proportions and percents. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know.